session. So today, coming on to our session today, I don't think I need to introduce my speaker too much. It's Malcolm Forbes-Cable, who's Vice President Upstream Consulting with Wood Mackenzie. Malcolm, welcome to Insight60. I'd quite like you to tell the audience a little bit about yourself rather than me. So would you like to give us maybe a minute, just a short introduction as to the role that you perform and how you've been involved in this particular project?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you to the OGTC for the opportunity to present today, and thank you for your time. So yeah, Malcolm Forbes-Cable, VP Upstream Consulting. I work within Wood Mackenzie's Edinburgh office, but we cover global reach, focused on the EMEARC region. And I've been with Wood Mac for 13 years. Prior to that, I was in operations, drilling operations, again, working globally. So I'm very familiar with the operational side of the business. But in the last 13 years, we've seen the business evolve. And particularly in the last few years, we've begun to see a real increase in energy transition issues. So when the opportunity came to work with the OGTC on this project, it was, fabulous. It was very exciting, and I think the results speak volumes. I think it's a really interesting study, and I hope it's going to be a valuable study for all of you and for the industry at large.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Malcolm. So we launched the report a few weeks ago. I know that everyone's very keen to hear what you have to say about the report today, and I'm sure there'll be tons of questions. So why don't we start? Over to you. Your 30-minute starts now.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Now, I appreciate there may be many questions. If we don't get to them to answer today, we will then subsequently follow up, and I can drop you an email on particular issues. So please don't be concerned if your question doesn't come up. Now, what are we going to do today? I'm going to do a few things. The first bit is what I'd like to do is explain what we've done here, so you all understand what the report was about and what the objective of the report was about. I would then like to look at the key technology findings. So, some of the key points that are raised in the report. I would hasten to add that there's a lot of detail in the report and a lot of detail around specific technologies. So I'll keep that pretty high level. But I just want to identify some key areas. I would then like to look at the size of the gap. So this is about the challenge we face in terms of getting to net zero.
Malcolm, you'll have to move your slides on. I'm afraid you're still on the house rules.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. I will come to the slides in a second. So, and then we'll look at interdependencies, and this is a critical part of the integrated energy system, the interdependencies. And then finally, we'll look at economics and employment. So we're going to start now. You probably see this slide and think, blimey, this is going to be a long presentation. But I assure you, this is the most, let's say, the most text you're going to see on a slide. But I thought it really important because I think this will help you understand what this study is about and perhaps what it's not about as well. At the start of the project, we ran a workshop, and we ran an industry workshop bringing in people from the oil and gas sector, the renewable sector, the hydrogen sector, from various industry bodies as well. We had over 30 people in a room together. And really the point of that exercise was to understand what people felt was the most important thing about this project and what I described as the project vision. And if any of you have been involved in these types of projects, I think that the key thing is to have a common understanding as to what you're doing, particularly when you've got something as complex as an energy roadmap for multiple sectors. So I wanted to highlight a few things that really came through, and that every time we were working on this project and all the team members, I said, this is what we're trying to do. If you're losing your way, come back and read this and understand what the focus is. So I've put in bold a few things that I just wanted to bring out there. So net zero integrated energy system that will support the offshore sector's critical role in the nation's economy. A big part of this, it's easy to look at the UKCS and go, well, it's about reducing emissions for oil and gas, but it has to be about so much more. There's so much that the North Sea and the UK continental shelf can provide to the nation, to the nation's economy, and enabling us to deliver on those net zero targets. So it's about the UKCS, but it casts a bright light over the rest of the economy as well. The second point there, and this was a very heartfelt point, it was about secure supply of affordable energy. Now, you know, there's concerns about doing studies like this and identifying technologies that may be interesting, but perhaps not relevant because of cost. So one of the things that we've really focused on is about how do we deliver affordable energy. So a lot of this is about when do the technologies come down the cost curve to be able to be effective. And on the back of that, you know, we feel that the investment is critical in particular areas which we've highlighted in the report. So UKCS will play a pivotal role in meeting the national net zero targets. Again, really critical that UKCS is part of the bigger picture and not an isolated part of the economy. And then finally, integral to achieving the net zero target, the development of new business that supplies skills, services and technologies to the UK and global energy markets. We see a massive opportunity here. And a big part of this report is not just looking at what fits into the UK, what is suitable for the UKCS, but where we can grow, where there's opportunity to develop new sectors, new industry, new manufacturing, and ultimately jobs. And that is absolutely core to this study. So with that in mind, that really, I hope, gives you a bit of a feel for the study. I'm going to play a short video, which is the shorter of the two which we have. I suggest you also look at the longer video, which I think there'll be a link to posted on OGTC's website. But this short video just gives a snapshot, a 30-second snapshot about where the North Sea is today and where we see it by 2050. Now, given that we're looking at a relatively small screen, there seems to be a lot of things going on in the North Sea. Clearly, the North Sea is a big space, so don't worry, the horizon's not going to be crowded with everything you see here, but hopefully this fires your imagination and gets you engaged. Okay, thank you to the design team who did a fabulous job there. So, okay, so that gives you a visual idea of where we see the North Sea over the next 30 years. But what I would like to talk about are some of the sort of key technology findings that we've identified. And as it says at the header there, you know, we feel that the UKCS has an absolutely, you know, fabulous competitive advantage in terms of the natural resources available, both below and above the surface as well. However, to get after this requires strategic thinking and also requires material investment to make sure that we can develop the technologies and we can, you know, exploit the potential. So looking at 5 things we've identified here, and there's some more on the next slide. We'll look at these one by one. So sustained investment is needed in oil and gas emissions technology. You know, there's no doubt about it. When we look at the UK sector, I think the first thing that comes to mind is the oil and gas sector. And when we look at the economic analysis, you'll see that the weighting is very much towards oil and gas today. In the future, that will diminish. However, we feel that this is a really, really important sector of focus for technology, because if we take a long-term view about where we're going to be, you know, by 2050, every scenario you look at requires oil and gas in some shape or form. Now, this is not for internal combustion engines. This is more for the petrochemical industry, you know, to create plastics, to create pharmaceuticals, and all the other essential products that we use. So we feel that it's essential that we get after and start reducing emissions across the oil and gas sector. A lot of people talk about electrification, but electrification is definitely not a panacea. And we see a lot of perhaps smaller efforts going on to reduce emissions across oil and gas operations. And the report looks at each one of these, identifies the challenge, but also identifies the opportunities, so that ultimately we can have a low emissions, very sustainable oil and gas sector, and also something that I think we can lead the world on, how to take a mature oil and gas base and make it low emissions. So that's the oil and gas sector. When we look at the offshore wind, you know, this is a phenomenal area of success for the UK. We've currently got about 10 gigawatts of installed capacity, and it's been, you know, it's the largest installed capacity in the world. But we continue to see innovation here, and we see a lot of focus on the equipment, on the turbines, and you know, scaling up. So, you know, increasing. At the moment, we're looking at 15 megawatt turbines, but we see continued requirements and innovations in the areas that are going to continue to deliver, you know, a really exciting sector. And we can see the growth before us. And when I look at each of the sectors, oil and gas, renewables, hydrogen, and carbon capture and storage, it's no doubt that the renewable sector forms the backbone of the net zero offshore. Looking also, if we look at offshore wind, I think a key area here is looking at the dichotomy of offshore wind. So currently, it's very much focused on fixed bottom, so you know, sitting connected to the seabed. But there's a huge potential, particularly when you look at the wider area of the UK continental shelf with floating wind. So I think that there's a recognition that in terms of the fixed bottom, we've been very successful in developing our own capacity, but perhaps less successful within the supply chain. So we see that offshore wind, the floating sector for offshore wind, is something that the UK really needs to get after and start developing the technologies that are going to make that work and bringing that cost down, to make sure that floating wind is something we can fully exploit. And again, if we crack that, that's going to be a fabulous area for exporting to other parts of the world. So if we look also over to the right here, I think a key area when we talk about the sort of the more integrated energy system, hydrogen is going to play a key role. Blue hydrogen we see as the sort of opening gambit here, in terms of establishing the market, establishing production, and also in step with carbon capture and storage being blue hydrogen. So there's particular areas that we see, you know, in terms of yield and enhanced CO2 capture efficiency that we think are going to be critical to make blue hydrogen commercial and scalable. Also, if we you know, look at the technological innovation relating to green hydrogen, again, this is going to be a critical area, and ultimately, as blue hydrogen establishes the way, we expect green hydrogen to follow. But again, these are areas that require further investment, further technological development, and especially bringing down the cost of hydrogen production for both blue and for green. So, you know, when we look at this in the totality, you know, this integrated energy system comprising of oil and gas, renewables, hydrogen, and carbon capture and storage, you know, we see an opportunity here for a total economic impact of 2.5 trillion over the next 30 years. And indeed, when we look at that and we look out beyond or out to 2050, you know, we see in excess of 300,000 jobs in this sector. We'll come on to that a little bit later, perhaps talking about the jobs, because that's you know, I think a critical part of this whole piece of work. So looking at the 6 points that we have on here, when we think about hydrogen transportation storage, there's a real opportunity here to use oil and gas knowledge, particularly in the subsurface, but also in the infrastructure. And I think key areas that we're going to need to understand is how, you know, how does hydrogen, how does long-term hydrogen storage within oil and gas reservoirs react, also within salt caverns. So there's some subsurface understanding to be done there, and also in terms of, you know, using the infrastructure, and you know, how do we retrofit the current infrastructure to be able to transport hydrogen. Hydrogen fuel cells, that comes up in the report, and I think is a key part of this, because as I said, we find that you know, electrification necessary, maybe from shore or from offshore, is not always the panacea, and there's going to be gaps. And maybe hydrogen fuel cells could be a means of providing power to offshore assets. Carbon capture and storage, we need to bring down the costs. You know, this is a fundamental part of the whole plan to get to net zero. And so making this cost effective, also developing the business model that is going to work here, I think is going to be critical for CO2. CO2 storage, again, rather linked to the hydrogen, you know, storage in oil and gas reservoirs. We need to understand how CO2 reacts in the subsurface. We're talking about long-term storage. We're talking about permanent storage here. So we need to know that it reacts and stays within the reservoir and doesn't leak. And then I think there's the second last point, penultimate point here, other renewable technologies. This really relates to you know, the renewable sector, so the marine sector, looking at wave and tidal. We feel there's a role to play. When we look at the scale at the moment, the scale of the marine sector is small relative to the offshore wind, but we absolutely do see a role here for these other sectors to play in the integrated energy system. Final point here is about interdependencies, and we've got a slide on this. We look at the technology roadmap, understanding these interdependencies, and I think both from a sort of regulatory and a strategic viewpoint is going to be fundamental to making a success of this, because you start to see the interconnectedness between each of the sectors, and you realize that they're all dependent on one another. So this is going to be a core part of the plan going forward. So just if we just have a look here, what I wanted to do was to help people understand the gap. So developing an integrated energy system, you know, is going to be absolutely core to meeting our net zero targets. But let's not kid ourselves. This is not an easy target we've set ourselves. Now, within the study, what we've done is to take the Committee on Climate Change scenario, a further ambition scenario, and use that as our targets, because they've essentially said by 2050, this is where we will need to be able to meet our net zero targets. So we've used that, and we've then, you know, taken that in mind and then said, okay, what are the technologies? How quickly are we going to need to scale up to be able to achieve that? So just to get in mind what that really means. Now, oil and gas, that's not part of the Committee on Climate Change. That's really a forecast using UK oil and gas, using OGA data. But clearly we see a decline in oil and gas over the period out to 2050. But as I say, you know, domestic supply of oil and gas, I think, is going to be absolutely critical. You look at the oil and gas, you look at the infrastructure, you look at the pipelines. Now, not all of that is going to be repurposed, but certainly there's an opportunity there to repurpose infrastructure and use it for the integrated system. If we look at where we are with hydrogen, so going down from oil and gas, you can see we've got a tall mountain to climb here. So we're currently producing about 27 terawatt hours. Now, this is not green or blue hydrogen, so we could effectively say we're at you know, closer to zero. But you can see this is a pretty impressive growth rate that we're going to have to achieve. Now, 270 terawatt hours, what is that? When I think of 270 terawatt hours, I look at the total power market, power capacity or power market in the UK, and it's about 300 terawatt hours. So we're looking at developing almost a national, we are developing a national scale of hydrogen production in a 30-year period. And clearly we're just at the pilot stage. So there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of investment to be made, and a lot of advances in technology required. If we look at the wind sector, so on the top right there, as I say, you know, there's a clear pathway ahead, and you look down on that slide there, 43 gigawatts of capacity. That's already visible. You know, we've got operational secured pipeline and early stage pipeline, and there's a lot of acreage to get after and beyond that. But thinking about building, you know, from 10.5 to 75 gigawatts, this seems very feasible. And indeed, you know, you could also look at the upside case on this, because there's plenty of opportunity here to capture capture power from the wind sector. 75 gigawatts. I think at the moment the UK has about 85 gigawatts of installed power capacity. So again, we're replacing, one power system, or we're trying to replicate a power system that already, the capacity that already exists. So a huge target. And then finally, CCUS, so carbon capture, utilization, storage. When we look at this, we've got to go from ground floor up to the top, and we're trying to get to 207. I can't see the numbers there. We're looking at a 55% compound annual growth rate. So, substantial growth required here. Again, we've got pilot, we've got feed, but we need to scale this up. We need to see more investment. Clearly, there's government money coming into this sector, but improving the pilots and scaling those up is going to be a big ask on the energy sector. But we are seeing, plenty of participants engaging in that sector. So, wanted to talk a little bit about interdependencies. Stephen, how are we doing on time? How long have I got? Just so I'm clear.
You have 10 minutes to go, Malcolm.
10 minutes to go. Okay, that should be fine. So this slide here is really looking at the technology roadmap. Now it's a simplification because there's a heck of a lot more in it than the things that we've identified here. But what we want to demonstrate here, if we start on the left side, is we're currently operating with four individual sectors. So 4 different silos. We've got oil and gas, we've got renewables, we've got hydrogen, and we've got CO2. By the time we get to 2050, and indeed before we get to 2050, we're going to see an interconnected and integrated energy system. And you look at the arrows on the right in yellow and then the arrows in black, you can see how each of these depends on another sector. So just looking at renewables is going to provide the power for green hydrogen. Renewables is going to provide the power for oil and gas. Oil and gas is going to provide, storage for, long-term storage of carbon, and so it goes on. So there's clearly a lot of interdependencies across the integrated system. So just looking at that and moving left to right, there's a few things to highlight here. So when I look at something like in the middle of the slide there, saltwater electrolysis, offshore hydrogen production, a big opportunity we see in this analysis is, offshore hydrogen production. So when wind power is not being utilized onshore on the grid, it can be used to create hydrogen, and that can be used for storage. But to make that succeed, we need to make sure that it works both from a hydrogen perspective, but also from a renewables perspective. So we need to make sure that we're aligned, and those two, those two sectors are connected. Again, if we look at the transmission infrastructure for offshore network, again, that's critical to the growth of renewables, but it's also going to be very important to the oil and gas sector. So all these interdependencies, I think, are a really important area of focus. And I think when we look at the regulatory aspects of this, I think this is a key, it should be a key area of focus. So coming to the final slide, so what does this actually mean in terms of economics and jobs? So on the left here, we've got a breakdown of the investment required and the economic impact. And then on the right, we have a view on 2020 employment, and then what we think the employment outlook will be by 2050. So big number here, 430 billion of investment will be required in the UKCS to get us to net zero. And this is going to be spread across all 4 sectors. So when we look at the investment, and part of the modelling here is to determine how much of that will be spent in the local market and how much will be spent in the international market. So if we look at oil and gas, the total investment required there is 123 billion, but we believe that 80 billion of that will be spent in the domestic market. When we look at renewables, we see a similar picture, 60 versus 100. And so on, and you can see the splits down there. When we look at the domestic economic impact, the total domestic economic impact, it's 2.5 trillion. This accounts for, let me just be clear, this accounts for all investment, and this looks at the sort of direct investment, indirect investment, and induced investment as well. So taking that modeling approach, input-output modeling approach, we've also then looked at employment and said, okay, well, what's the employment opportunity here? How do we see this changing over time? And when we look at the 2020 jobs, you can see, 90% of the jobs are currently within the oil and gas sector, and the remainders, a majority of are in the renewables, a little bit in hydrogen, and a few in carbon capture, utilization, storage. When we get to 2050, you can see this picture dramatically changes, and that we see increased employment, but we see a reduction, less than 20% will be involved in the oil and gas sector, nearly 50% involved in the renewable sector, and you can see the share for hydrogen and CCUS. So we see a real change in the workforce. We see a real change in the opportunities that are going to come about as we develop and evolve the energy system on the UKCS. One thing I would add to this is that when we think about export market, within these numbers, it's worth highlighting that within these numbers, the oil and gas numbers take account of those involved in exports. As probably most people know, a large part of what Aberdeen does is to service the international oil and gas business. And the numbers here, when we look at renewables, hydrogen, CCS, don't capture that. We don't capture the upside we see for employment. So I really see an upside to this, because if we follow the success of the oil and gas sector, and we think about the business created through exports, if we can replicate that in renewables, if we can replicate it in hydrogen, and we can replicate it in CCUS, there's a much bigger prize to go after. Stephen, I think that's probably me done. Is that my time?
Yeah, I think more or less that's on bang on time. Thank you, Malcolm. Right, so please, panelists, remember to unmute. We're going to come to you next. Let me introduce the panel. So we have Myrtle Dawes, who's our Solution Centre Director, Martin Tulloch, who's Director of the Net Zero Solutions Centre, and Rob Barry, who is our expert from Chrysor on the panel. Let's open up to the panel to ask some questions and make some comments on what they've just heard from Malcolm. Who would like to go first?
I'll jump in, Stephen. Thank you very much for the presentation, Malcolm. It was fascinating. You mentioned working internationally in your introductory notes, and to me that's one of the things that's quite unique about our industry, especially here in the northeast of Scotland, is the huge export markets that we managed to tap into. Now, Wood Mac are a global consultancy. I'd just be interested in your thoughts on the international opportunity for technology in particular, and some of the technologies that you've identified within the report.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Yeah, very, very good question. Look, let's reflect a moment on this report. Is this report being consumed in the UK? Absolutely. Is there massive interest for the work that we're doing internationally? Completely. I mean, what is really interesting, I think, about the North Sea, the UK sector, is the strong legacy that we have in technological development. And, when we look back to the 70s, we look at all the technologies that were developed and the frontiers that were crossed to develop the North Sea. We really believe that we have a similar opportunity when it comes to the other sectors. So when you sort of relate that to exports, we see a huge opportunity, particularly if we can lead in areas, we can develop technologies, we can establish ways of delivering low-cost energy. That's going to catch the attention of international markets, and that's going to create export opportunities, and that will create jobs. So I strongly believe in that.
Thanks, Malcolm. Myrtle, I know you've got a couple of questions and comments that I'm sure you'd like to pose.
Yes, okay, thanks, Malcolm. Fascinating report. I'm still digesting it because it's got loads of information. So one of the questions I wanted to ask was actually about the offshore renewables. I mean, the majority of what we're really talking about is wind. What do you think we are going to need to do from a technology perspective to unlock wave and tidal, given that we're an island and we've got this massive resource out there?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and I will say that, you know, the report very much focuses on offshore wind, just because of the scale of that and the visibility of that. But also an important part of, you know, what we've looked at is also the marine sector, so the wave and tidal. As you say, there's no doubt we're an island nation. There's huge potential there. But there are challenges. And I think one of the challenges is, if I sort of compare it to offshore renewables, it's the scaling up. It's the ability to be able to really scale. So I think that the challenge for that sector and the technological development that needs to happen is around how can we develop systems that we can use, you know, in multiple locations, and not just be location specific. So I think that's going to be the challenge. There's definitely the opportunity there. There's a lot of energy to be generated from the marine sector, but it's just that's, you know, how do we scale this up? How do we make this a material contributor to the energy mix?
Thank you.
Thanks, Myrtle. Rob, would like to bring you into the conversation here. What's your perspective, having heard Malcolm's presentation and read the report?
Yeah, it was fun being part of it, and it was great. Chris sponsoring some of it and supporting Malcolm with some of it as well. So I think it's a great piece of work. It plots where we are and the destination and the potential route to the destination. The part for me, I suppose, the question is, Malcolm, which I've aired with you before, is during this journey of the energy transition, it's how we don't offshore the carbon leakage, embedded carbon during this journey, and we actually do try and keep security of supply, etc., within the UK, and retaining those potential jobs as well. It's not necessarily a technology blocker, but I just want to hear your views on that.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Yeah, and yeah, you've been, you know, great help. Crystal's been a great help in delivering this report. This is a question we sometimes get. You know, what relevance does the offshore, the oil and gas sector have in a sort of a net zero world? Any forecast you look at out to 2050, even the most optimistic forecasts still have hydrocarbons as a key component of the energy mix. And as I said, I think I said before, it's not about, you know, using fuels internal combustion engines. It's about, you know, the petrochemical sector. It's about all the products that are required. So it's feedstock for that sector. Now, we could say, well, let's you know, like we've done with other industries, let's offshore it. Let's push it internationally. However, I think that completely misses the point, because ultimately we need to manage our own emissions. We need to do that in the lowest emissions way. We need to have low emissions barrels. And I believe by using the infrastructure that we have in the UK, we are able to exploit the remaining reserves, and we're able to deliver very sustainable barrels. So I think it's critically important that the UK continues to develop its reserves, but pays increasing attention to reducing emissions. And again, come back to that export point. I see the UK leading in this sector. I see the UK being able to export the technologies, export the expertise that it develops in this sector. So it's absolutely critical to the future of the North Sea and making sure that we're accountable for our emissions.
Super, thanks, Rob. As you can expect, we've got quite a few questions coming through the chat function now, Malcolm. So what I'd like to do now is just open up the forum, really get people involved in asking questions directly. Some folk are asking me to read their questions, but we'll see if Jonathan Murray, if you're available and ready to ask your question, would you like to do so?
Hi, Stephen. Yeah, this is a question for Malcolm. Just on your slide, for the jobs that you expect to see supporting the renewables industry. I saw that it was quite a large number, 160,000. So do you see these jobs mainly being in the manufacturing side of renewables? As I would have thought the operations and maintenance side of renewables is going to be less intensive than what we have in the operations and maintenance of the oil and gas industry at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. I think when we look at the employment numbers, we haven't broken it down into where the particular the different components of the employment mix. But however, when we look at the requirement for investment, when we look at the requirement for so basically the capex and the opex elements, we see work both in the manufacture side, and particularly if we start to see a growth in floating wind, we would hope that we would see a lot of employment in that sector, both in the manufacture side, but also in the export side. So, I can't give you sort of specifics around where specifically we see those jobs, but we certainly see, a significant amount of people working in the renewable sector, across manufacture, across CapEx, and across OpEx as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Marianne Nuzzo has a question. Marianne, are you free to ask your question, please?
Yes. Hello. I was wondering if you know which institution in the government, or if there is one, is in charge of monitoring the greenhouse gas emissions and adapting the targets and adapting the plan for the development of the Net Zero North Sea to meet those targets.
I might pass that over to OGTC because they're probably more familiar with that, or indeed to Rob. I don't know, what's your take on that? Is it BEIS or is it some other department that's looking after the emissions?
I would probably point Marianne in the direction of the Committee on Climate Change. They're a non-departmental government body, a Quango, and they certainly give advice to all four governments, the UK, the Scottish, the Welsh and the Northern Irish government, in terms of what we need to do to get to net zero. And all our strategy is based in a large part on their recommendations, the hydrogen, the 270 terawatt hours, for example. We also have really strong regulators in the offshore sector. It's the Oil and Gas Authority, and they're working closely with Ofgem. There's an overlap between offshore wind and oil and gas that we want to make sure that we make as smooth as possible. But definitely in terms of the targets, the Committee on Climate Change is the lead government body, although they're not a formal department. And we're waiting with bated breath on their revised targets, which will be published later this year. But that is probably where I would point Marianne towards initially. I don't know if you've got any insights there, Rob or Myrtle.
From my side, the key stakeholder for the upstream is the OGA. So they would be, from a regulatory point of view, directing us what we should be trying to achieve, and we obviously can guide what that looks like from a realistic point of view without being too detrimental to the current business. And also BEIS plays a role as well. They're also supporting, BEIS supports a lot of the early funding work for some of these pilot projects, and obviously some of the business models that comes out of hydrogen and carbon capture.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Marianne. Nisha, you have a question. I wonder if you'd like to pose it directly to Malcolm, please.
Yeah, sure. Malcolm, you mentioned, understanding and managing interdependencies would be key on the road to net zero. So I was wondering if what do you think are the biggest stumbling blocks thus far, if any, in understanding and managing those interdependencies?
Yeah. Okay. I would highlight two, and that there are plenty. I think one is one of the ones I briefly mentioned, which is around the offshore network. So for both renewables and for oil and gas. So having, I think having the regulatory environment, but also having the vision to invest in infrastructure that will service both offshore wind and also the oil and gas sector. So that's going to require coordination, alignment between two different sectors. I'd also then say, if we think about other interdependencies, the other one I'd probably highlight is just thinking about, we make mention of a lot of reuse, repurposing of the existing infrastructure, so typically the oil and gas infrastructure. And I think we need to think about, how do we coordinate that? How do we make sure that we don't miss an opportunity here in terms of using that infrastructure and being able to use pipelines for piping CO2 offshore, use pipelines for hydrogen and so on, using platforms maybe for siting different equipment. So yeah, I see those as two key areas, but I think if you read through the report, you'll see that there's plenty more. Thanks, Nisha.
Thank you. Mark Calverley, you posed a question on the chat. Would you like to go ahead and ask the question of Malcolm, please?
Yes, this really relates to the targets and our commitment to the Paris Agreement. That's really set at a national level. I'm just wondering how Malcolm might see that we flow that down through government departments to devolved nations and to regional councils, etc., to actually meet those targets. And then how do we bring the solutions that are in this report to those different people?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I see what you're asking, Mark. I would say, in terms of looking at the specific target, obviously, UK has a 2050 net zero target. Scotland has a 2045 net zero target. Now, what we haven't tried to do here is a quantitative exercise in terms of how do we remove carbon molecules from the system, and where do we get to in the end. So we've really just followed what we've taken from the Committee on Climate Change report, the further ambitions, and they're saying this is the sort of infrastructure, this is the sort of system that we're going to require to be able to achieve our net zero targets. Now, how that filters down to different governments, different regions, I don't know, but I expect and I hope that this will be part of the Energy White Paper, which I think is due for publication later this year, but I'm not sure if that slips into next year. So I'm hoping we get some guidance and clarity on that from the paper.
I'll maybe just add from an OGTC perspective, Malcolm, that we're looking at this quite practically, and we, as you mentioned, we need to basically create a new hydrogen industry. We need to have a huge increase in the amount of offshore wind, and we need the carbon storage sector to grow exponentially as well. So we need, there's opportunity for regions from Shetland in the north, who we're working with actively, all the way down to the south of England. Again, we're actively working with the communities around Bacton to try and do something with that fantastic strategic asset. So we see huge opportunity for communities across the UK to benefit from the energy transition, and also a huge opportunity for the engineering community, the oil and gas community in the northeast of Scotland, to play a leading role in that transition.
Thanks, Martin. Let me ask a question, Malcolm, and this can be answered, I guess, by Martin and Myrtle as well as yourself. So given you've done all this work, what really are the technology pain points that need to be resolved in order for us to unlock the potential to grow a hydrogen economy, or to have CCUS as a reality in the UKCS?
Well, I can perhaps sort of tack, if I give my view on that, and then if Myrtle and Martin want to add. But one of the things I highlighted, I think, on the previous slide was the saltwater electrolysis. So I think this seems to be a critical part of being able to deliver net zero and develop a hydrogen economy. So I see that as a key area, and that's combined desalination and then electrolysis. So figuring out how we do that offshore, I think would be really important. And when I look at the CCUS, I think there's plenty of projects around the world where we see CCUS in action. So the technology works, but I think again, it's about understanding, how we increase the efficiency of carbon capture technology, and also, the how carbon reacts in the reservoir for long-term storage. I think those are really important areas. Martin, I don't know if there's other areas that you would particularly highlight.
So no, I think you've definitely spotted the ones that I would have mentioned. But I think generally for the technology, I'd say that even though the technology is working, I don't believe it is at the right price point to make the energy affordable necessarily to the consumers or business at the moment. So I think the innovation around that technology so that it is accessible as well as actually being functional is quite important.
I'll just jump in. I've got something to add there. So one of the critical elements for enabling hydrogen is the amount we can transport in existing gas networks. That's a major blocker for sizing any sizable plants in the UK. Obviously, there has to be a lot of safety checks, so a building a safety case, and that is a major enabler. So it's a route to market out with the technology challenge of producing it, and that's fundamental to enabling a hydrogen economy if that is going to be a major part of the mix. So being able to transport and distribute hydrogen in the existing gas network is critical to enabling building plants big enough to get an economies of scale that allows affordable hydrogen to be produced. And there's work ongoing on that area, but it's really important that a timeline's developed sooner rather than later to enable this, and I see that being a key blocker. And on the carbon side, exactly what Malcolm's saying is cost. Ultimately, it's not so much the transport and storage cost, it's actually the carbon capture cost. It's incredibly energy intensive, so the OPEX to operate that plant is very high with the conventional technology, so that cost needs to come down substantially to allow affordable carbon capture to happen.
And where are we on that journey to bring the cost down, do you think, panel and Malcolm? Do we have quite a lot of technology research and development still to be done, or has that journey already started and we're some way down the line?
I would say we still need substantial investment in innovation to get there, and I think that's the crux of this report. It's identifying, there's certain areas that are going to be fundamental to us achieving a net zero target, and the ones we've highlighted, we would say that particularly important to the UKCS.
Okay, grand. We have a question from the audience. Kelly Murray, are you able to ask your question, please?
I think so. Can you hear me?
We can.
Just taking that question a little bit further. So we've talked about the technology focus areas. I just wondered if there was a sense of which of the 4 key sectors requires most innovation to close the gap. And what I mean by that is in terms of like known current entrepreneurship and startup businesses, how they're focused, where are the biggest opportunities?
Yeah, okay, well, I can take a stab at that, and then I'd be interested to hear other members of the panel. When I look at the 4 sectors, so on the slide there, we've got the 4 sectors on the left. There's no doubt that the one that gives me greatest confidence, and we've got a track record, we've got momentum on, is renewables. However, we're so reliant on renewables that continues to need innovation, and so sort of subset of that would be the floating offshore wind, which is going to be key. But then the things that probably stand out to me in terms of how nascent they are, it really relates to hydrogen and CO2. These are areas that we need material advances in technologies, and as everybody's highlighted, also in bringing down costs. So they to me, those 2 sectors to me are, major opportunities and areas that we really need to focus our attention on.
Panel, any comments on that?
Yeah, I'd say I definitely think it's hydrogen. I think especially if we're going to be creating hydrogen using renewables, it's a very a lot of energy is lost in that process, and we do need to have sustainable processes going on. So I think that, you know, it might be we might even need to go back to the basic science and have new processes which get us from something like electricity to green hydrogen, as opposed to some of the processes that we've got at the moment. So I think that that area is probably open for disruption and for new scientific ideas to come out for new unit operations.
Yeah, I would echo that. So on hydrogen, efficiency is king. So both for blue and green hydrogen, if you can get closer to the 85–90% efficiencies for these plants, OPEX is a significant factor in the costs of producing hydrogen. And also for carbon capture, efficiency is also king. So if we can get the efficiency up to actually capture and then sequester the carbon, whoever comes up with the solutions to drive the efficiencies up to on both those areas will be in a very good place. So converting the renewable electricity to capture carbon or create hydrogen or convert methane to hydrogen will be on a winner ultimately, because that's really where the driver is to get the cost down ultimately in those areas.
Super,
Thanks,
thank
Rob.
you.
Thanks, Kelly. We have a question from a student, which is always good to see. ECT from doing an MSc at RGU in offshore in oil and gas engineering. EC, are you able and happy to ask your question, please?
Yes. Can you hear me clearly?
We can.
Okay. So my question is, what areas or aspects of the energy transition would be beneficial to research on for the oil and gas sector? Because I am at my project stage just now, so I've always wanted to do something that will be relevant to the industry, and not just to better technology for an industry that would not really function properly. But I am now of the opinion, I've come to know, that the oil and gas sector will be around for the longest time. It's just that we wouldn't be burning the fuels anymore. We'll be using it differently. So for this energy transition era, what would be a very relevant area to go into research for the oil and gas sector?
Myrtle, I'm going to pass that to you, because I reckon you've got a list as long as your arm on these kind of things.
Sorry, I actually was thinking. Look, to be clear, I think all of these areas could do with some research. Personally, I'm minded to look at some of the research around CCUS. I think we need that urgently, because the short-term emission targets really need to be addressed, and all of that work around the reservoir behavior, how we inject and how we capture, not just for the offshore industry, but to help the industrial clusters. I think that's absolutely key. So I certainly would be thinking that that is an area that needs attention. I think overall there is work also, I think, that we need on things like, how do we get what we would call a heat and mass balance, the energy balance across some of these systems, such that we don't lose as much, because what we've done is just to add processes together so we can get the outcome. But that really needs to be refocused, and we need to have some more pressure going on innovating different processes to make these things work.
Okay. So thank you very much. So that's CCUS. To
Yes.
find out how we can get an energy balance for the...
Yes, so I would say if I had some time, I would be looking at how we address the energy balance for what we're doing here. We would do that on a normal project, but this really needs that focus, because there's a lot of losses at the moment. That's going to drive up cost.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Malcolm. I appreciate it.
Thank you, EC. Thanks for your question. It's always good to finish with a good practical question from someone who's actually doing some work in academia. So thanks very much. Well, that's us at the end of the session. Thank you to Malcolm for a fascinating presentation. Thank you to our panel for posing really insightful questions. And thank you to everyone for joining us today for the Insight60. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us. But before I close, I would like to take the opportunity to recommend a couple of other things that are coming up. This Friday, the 2nd of October at 11 o'clock to 11:45, we'll be hosting a Tech 20 virtual session at OGTC. And the session will be looking at enabling Scotland's 5G future, which will be presented by Paul Coffey, who's CEO of Scotland's 5G Centre. And then next week, on the 9th of October, again at 11 o'clock, we'll be doing another Tech 20 looking at developing a net zero roadmap for Scottish industry, which will be presented by Mike Smith, who's Chief Executive of Nexus, the Northeast Carbon Capture and Utilisation and Storage Alliance. So if you can, please go onto our website and join those sessions. We look forward to seeing you there. But thank you again for taking the time, and see you at the next Insight60 soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.